When an avoidant man hurts a good woman, he often assumes the damage stays contained to that moment, that argument, that silence, or that cold distance he created. But what he doesn't realize is that a good woman doesn't always break loudly. She doesn't always cry, argue, or walk away in a visible way. Sometimes she fractures quietly, inside herself, and that kind of breaking changes everything. Because while he believes time will fix it, she slowly starts making a different decision within. She becomes emotionally tired in a way that isn't obvious on the surface. She stops explaining things that should not need explanation. She stops chasing consistency from someone who keeps withdrawing. She stops reaching for warmth that only appears when she is already pulling away. And without any dramatic announcement, she begins to detach. By the time he finally notices the emptiness, by the time he feels her absence echoing, she has already shifted in the way that matters most. Even if she is still physically present, emotionally, she has started to leave. If you've ever seen someone become calm after being hurt repeatedly, that's what this looks like. It isn't revenge or manipulation. It's an internal turning point where she realizes love should not feel like begging for basic care. A good woman can tolerate confusion, mixed signals, and emotional inconsistency longer than most people expect. She can understand a man's fear and still respond with patience. But there is a limit she cannot cross forever. Repeated hurt without accountability, repeated withdrawal without repair, and repeated emotional neglect that is never acknowledged. That's where something inside her shifts. Not because she stops loving, but because she finally sees clearly. From the outside, she may still seem the same. She might still talk, still smile, still sit across from him. But internally, she is no longer fully open. She is observing now, measuring, protecting what is left of her emotional safety. And this is the stage most people miss, because the relationship still appears intact, while something essential has already ended within her. The first thing he begins to lose is her emotional safety, the calm presence, the softness, the sense of ease she naturally brought into the connection. Without realizing it, he had been leaning on that steadiness. He felt comfortable not because of distance or control, but because her presence regulated the emotional space between them. As she gets hurt repeatedly, that softness begins to fade. Her tone becomes more careful, her energy more contained. She is not being cold, she is protecting herself. And slowly, he starts feeling a shift he cannot easily explain. Things feel less easy, less warm, less safe. What he is actually sensing is her nervous system no longer fully trusting him. Then the warmth starts disappearing in subtle ways. Replies become shorter. Her laughter doesn't flow as freely. Conversations stay on safer ground. She avoids emotional depth because depth used to lead to pain. The connection still exists on the surface, but the emotional life inside it begins to thin out. He notices small things: a shorter hug, a delayed response, less excitement when he enters the room. And only then does he start realizing what he had taken for granted, the natural warmth that once made him feel grounded in her presence. Over time, the dynamic shifts. She is no longer the one chasing understanding or over-explaining silence. The hope that once kept her attached starts to feel heavier than the fear of leaving. And when that point arrives, the old pattern breaks. Now he is the one noticing distance, analyzing silence, questioning changes in her energy. The space he once used for comfort starts to feel unsettling because it is no longer filled with her emotional waiting. It feels final instead of safe. At the same time, her softness, the gentle, unguarded part of her, begins to close. Not out of anger, but self-protection. She stops giving access to the parts of her that used to love freely. And once that emotional openness shuts down, it does not reopen easily. He may try to reconnect, apologize, or suddenly show effort when he senses loss. But by then, her softness has already learned the truth through experience, not words. And what was once freely given is no longer available on demand. And when that realization finally lands, it doesn't arrive as drama or shock. It comes quietly, almost uninvited, like something he can't ignore anymore. Some losses are so silent at first that they don't feel real until they become permanent. And that's when the thoughts begin to turn against him. Not the surface level thoughts, but the uncomfortable ones he usually avoids. Maybe I was the one who caused this. Maybe I labeled her as too needy when all she wanted was honesty. Maybe I called it pressure when it was actually responsibility. Maybe I kept saying I needed space because it sounded better than admitting I was afraid of real closeness. And this is where his usual mental defenses start collapsing, because a good woman has a way of breaking the story he used to tell himself about why things end. She wasn't controlling him. She wasn't demanding perfection. She wasn't impossible. She gave room. She showed patience. She tried to understand more than most people would. She stayed longer than she probably should have. So if even she reached a point of stepping back, then what explanation is left that still protects his old narrative? This is the moment avoidance stops looking like a personality trait and starts looking like something self-destructive. He begins replaying everything differently. The conversations he shut down, the moment she reached for him and he pulled away, the patience she extended that he assumed would always be there. He doesn't always speak these realizations out loud, but internally, something shifts. A quiet doubt starts building, and it's heavier than guilt because it doesn't come with an immediate solution. Understanding your own pattern is one thing. Knowing how to change it is something else entirely. That gap can feel unbearable, and if this is the point that resonates, it's because what comes after is usually the hardest part to sit with. He tries to move forward in his own way. Maybe he talks to new people, distracts himself with work, fills his time, keeps things light, keeps things temporary, keeps things under control. On the surface, life continues, but something underneath doesn't settle. New conversations feel okay, but not deep. New connections have moments of attraction, but lack emotional ease. One person feels too intense too quickly. Another feels too distant to build anything real. Another is interesting, but doesn't create comfort. And slowly, without forcing it, he starts noticing a pattern he didn't expect. What he had before wasn't perfect, but it was rare. A woman who could care without overwhelming him, who could stay close without trying to take away his independence, who could sense his emotional distance and respond with patience instead of punishment. That kind of balance is not easy to find. He may not have valued it fully when it was there, but its absence becomes louder in every new interaction. Each new person, each new attempt, starts to reflect something back to him. Not that others are lacking, but that the emotional quality he once had doesn't appear so easily again. And now regret starts to deepen, not as emotion, but as comparison. A clear, uncomfortable comparison. He begins to understand that what he lost wasn't just connection, it was something that had real potential to become stable if he had met it with more honesty and presence. At some point, the very patterns that once felt protective begin to feel suffocating. Distance, emotional control, withdrawal, silence, all the strategies that once gave him comfort start to feel different in isolation. The quiet lasts too long. The space feels too empty. The independence turns into something heavier than freedom. He starts realizing something he never expected. Those behaviors only felt manageable because there was still someone on the other side of them trying to stay connected. Her presence softened the weight of his avoidance, even while he was pushing her away. But now she is no longer filling in the gaps. She is no longer interpreting his silence, no longer reaching across emotional distance. And without that presence, his avoidance has nothing left to balance it. What remains is just emptiness, unfiltered. And that's where it hits differently. Not as loneliness that passes, but as something deeper. The kind that doesn't leave just because he stays busy. The kind of loneliness that shows up in a quiet room when there is nothing left to distract you from your own thoughts. The kind that makes you question whether all that emotional distance, all that avoidance, all those defenses were actually worth what they cost you. It is not a comfortable realization, but it is a revealing one. Because it slowly exposes something he didn't want to admit. The habits that once felt protective may have spared him temporary discomfort, but they also quietly pushed away the very kind of love that could have stayed. Meanwhile, her shift continues, and it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It starts in simple ways. She sleeps more peacefully. Her phone no longer holds her attention the same way. She stops replaying conversations in her head or imagining different endings. She begins to see how much of her energy was going into holding on to someone who was already drifting away. So she starts taking that energy back. She reconnects with herself, with her routines, her peace, her own emotional rhythm. She laughs without needing validation. She makes decisions without second guessing how they will affect someone else's mood. Slowly, she remembers what stability feels like when it comes from within. And with every small step back into herself, his access to the old version of her fades a little more. The version that was endlessly patient, constantly explaining, always reaching first. That version was powered by hope. And when hope changes, so does the person carrying it. She becomes clearer, more grounded, less willing to romanticize confusion. There is still love in her, but it is no longer unguarded. It is filtered through self-respect. It now requires consistency. It no longer tolerates emotional imbalance in the name of potential. That is why attempts to return often don't work anymore. He is trying to reach a woman who no longer exists in the same emotional state. And that mismatch is painful, even confusing. Because from the outside, she still looks like the same person, but internally, everything has been reorganized. If you've ever seen a woman appear calm after heartbreak, this is usually why. She is not empty. She is no longer scattered. She has stopped building her life around someone else finally becoming consistent. She is building it around herself. And yes, sometimes he comes back, often not from clarity, but from absence, from the weight of silence, from loneliness finally breaking through his defenses, from the realization that what he had actually mattered more than he admitted at the time. So he reaches out, a message, a memory, a casual check-in, sometimes even words that sound emotional, like they carry depth and regret, things that might have reopened everything before. But timing changes meaning. And this is where the hardest truth appears. Missing someone is not the same as being ready for them. Regret is not the same as repair. Words are not the same as change. If he returns without real growth, he is not offering love again. He is offering repetition, just in a softer tone. And a woman who has done real inner work can feel that difference now. She is no longer responding only to emotion. She is listening for consistency, accountability, and emotional maturity. So even if part of her still feels something, that is no longer enough to reopen what cost her peace. Because she now understands something deeply. Love without safety turns into exhaustion. Love without consistency becomes confusion. Love without mutual effort becomes self-abandonment. And she has already lived through that lesson once. What makes all of this so significant is that it changes both of them in different ways. He begins to understand that care is not guaranteed, that patience is not infinite, that someone can understand your wounds and still choose not to stay in them with you. That emotional distance eventually has consequences, even if they arrive quietly and late. And she learns something just as important. That loving deeply does not mean enduring endlessly. That kindness does not require tolerance of repeated harm. That the moment she stops abandoning herself, life becomes quieter, but in a way that feels stable, not empty. So if you are the one who was hurt, this is not a story of loss. It is a story of return to self. And if you are the one who caused the hurt, the hardest moment is not always when she leaves, or when she is silent, or even when she stops responding. It is the moment you realize she is no longer the same person you left behind, because she didn't just move on. She grew past the version of herself that waited,